Hello, and welcome to Thinkling's Books. My name's Deborah, and today we're going to be discussing narrative promises. Have you ever read a book only to, by the end, feel let down, even betrayed by it? Have you ever read one that really builds up this romantic tension between these two characters, only to let it fizzle out with no real resolution? Or maybe you've read an action book and they've really built up this heist for chapter after chapter, and then the next chapter is just talking about, oh yeah, that heist went well, without ever letting you read it. Or perhaps you've been following these two groups of people who are at odds and are clashing, but you know they have to work together if they're going to save the world. And then they'll do 180 and they're perfectly fine with one another and there's no conflict. What were you worried about? Well, frankly, I don't blame you if you feel betrayed or let down or confused or disappointed if any of these things happened. Because what these things are is when a narrative does not fulfill its narrative promises. A narrative promise is precisely what it sounds like. It's a promise made by the narrative to the audience. And narrative promises can come in all different forms. Books have literally hundreds of narrative promises in them. And some of these narrative promises are based on genre. For example, if you pick up a murder mystery, there's a narrative promise that you will learn who done it. And there's a narrative promise that the mystery will be a major part of the book. If you are reading a book which has very elegant, old-fashioned prose and is just beautiful and lyrical, and then in chapter 10 it drops an F-bomb, it has also dropped the narrative promise of its prose style. I mentioned in my beginnings video that I had read a purported sequel to Dracula that began in Bram Stoker's style and promised this worthy Dracula sequel, only to drop that and then never come back to it, and how disappointed I was. What I didn't mention in that video is that the character of Dracula himself doesn't show up until the last chapter. The book is over 500 pages long. Come on, book. You promised me a sequel to Dracula. Give me Dracula. He needs to be a main character. That was inherent narrative promise in the sort of book it was. But of course there are also a lot of narrative promises within the body of the book. I mentioned one of them of, if two groups are fighting against each other, there's a narrative promise that there will be some sort of truthful resolution to that. And by truthful resolution, I don't mean both sides just suddenly decide they're friends. I mean, how would it actually happen? The idea that the narrative needs to tell the truth, to accurately, based on its world building and its characters, to believably create what happens next, is an inherent and essential part of fulfilling a narrative promise. Because if the reader doesn't believe the fulfillment, it's not going to be satisfactory, even if it's what the reader might have thought they wanted. One really good place to look at and examine narrative promises is in romance. And the reason I'm using romance is because most people inherently, in their hearts, just know if a romantic plotline ended up like it should have, and by should have I mean as it was promised, regardless of what that might be. It depends a lot on characters and genres. And so I want to take you through the basic beats of two romance novels, in this case Gone with the Wind and Pride and Prejudice, that have similar beats, but very different characters and very different resolutions that are equally good and equally satisfactory. Let's start with Gone with the Wind. So, in Gone with the Wind, our protagonist is Scarlett O'Hara. And Scarlett is narcissistic and manipulative and vain and cunning. And she wants Ashley. Ashley is a good guy. He wants to marry a good woman. On the other hand, there's Rhett Butler, who is also cunning, manipulative, narcissistic, etc. And he, knowing exactly what Scarlet is like, has fallen in love with her and wants her. And he actually does succeed in getting her to marry him for his money. But she is still going after Ashley until Ashley's wife dies. And now that she finally actually could dump Rhett and go after him, Scarlet realizes he was never right for her, and she's in love with Rhett. And Margaret Mitchell could have ended the narrative line here. She could be like, hey, look, he's in love with him, he's in love with her, they could be happy and live out all their days. And she would have broken her narrative promise. Because you see, we know these characters. We know how they bicker and how selfish they are, and we know the way in which this book works. Something is going to go wrong. And sure enough, pretty much the same moment that Scarlet finally decides she's in love with Rhett, Rhett decides that he has had enough. Clearly Scarlet will never be in love with him, and he's just going to take off. And he does. And when he finally comes back to basically announce that he's leaving permanently, Scarlet finally confesses, I love you. And he replies, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And he leaves. Now, Margaret Mitchell could have ended it here. I mean, that's truthful, right? Like, Rhett actually would have left. Sucks to be you, Scarlet. But first of all, this isn't satisfying based on the fact that we have just spent more than 1,000 pages reading about these characters, and we have been promised an epic romance between them, not one just taking off. Like, no. That's not the sort of book this is. Does not need a tragic ending. It needs a gritty ending, but not a tragic ending. Furthermore, we know what Scarlet is like. Sure enough, when Rhett leaves her, Scarlet's reaction is, I'm gonna get him back. And the reader believes her. And so the reader, even though we don't see it, the reader gets the satisfactory ending of these characters being together, but gets the truthfulness of, yeah, but they're going to be together in their cunning, manipulative, narcissistic fashion, and it's, you know, it ain't going to be pretty, but sure going to be fun. Now, take this in comparison to Pride and Prejudice, which, as I said, follows a similar romantic beats, but has basically reversed characters. So, our protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, is a good woman. She is generous and kind and humble and flawed, but a good woman. And she is going after a man who is cunning and manipulative and narcissistic, and generally a bad dude. On the other hand, Mr. Darcy is interested in Elizabeth. And he is a good, upstanding man, although he has the flaw of being prideful. And so we get our first beat, which is Darcy proposes to Elizabeth. And so Jane Austen could have ended the story here. Oh, look, you know, Elizabeth says yes, and they're happily ever after. Except the reader knows that Elizabeth absolutely loathes Mr. Darcy at this point. She thinks very badly of him. She's definitely not in love with him. And she's heard all sorts of slander that she believes about him. And so what actually happens is she tells this to him to his face quite nastily. Yeah, that went well. But as a result of this, Mr. Darcy not only gives her the actual information that makes her no longer believe the slander against him, but he also realizes that she's right, his behavior has been inappropriately prideful and arrogant, and so he mends himself. And the next time Elizabeth sees him, she sees a new him, she sees what he's really like, and she sees an improved version of him, and she ends up falling in love with him. So Jane Austen could have ended the story there. Look, we know he loves her, and she loves him, and they can get married and live happily ever after. Except they can't, because Elizabeth has turned Mr. Darcy down, and Mr. Darcy's a proud man, and so she is convinced that he's not going to renew his offer, if you will. And of course, if this were Scarlett O'Hara, she'd be like, yeah, I'm gonna get him. But she's not. She's not cunning, she's not manipulative, she's not selfish, she is humble, and she's willing to accept her broken heart. And this is truthful both to her character and to Mr. Darcy's character. And that is so not a satisfactory ending. The actual ending is Mr. Darcy coming to her again and saying, you were right to tell me off. Maybe you didn't do it in the best way possible, but you were right to tell me off. I still love you. Do you have any interest in me? And Elizabeth saying, heck yeah, I do. And they get married and they live happily ever after. And the reader is like that. So, there we have it. Fulfill narrative promises successfully. Truth-telling ends to two parallel but different romantic plot lines that come to different ends but equally fulfill what they need to fulfill in line with their characters' plots, themes, tone, and quality. And so they should. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you found this video interesting or informative, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell to learn of new uploads. In the meantime, leave me a comment. Are there any books you've read that have really fulfilled or not fulfilled a narrative promise? And are there any topics that you'd particularly like me to cover? Until next time.